Afternoon, this hearing of the Congressional Executive Commission on China will come to order. The title of this hearing is the Communist Partys Crackdown on Religion in China. And we'll have one panel that will testify today. It'll feature Miragul Tursun, a Uyghur Muslim who was interned in and survived a Chinese quote-unquote political re-education camp. That's not what I call it, that's what they call it, but in fact it is something more nefarious than that. Translating for her is Ms. Zubaira Shamsheddin. She is the Chinese Outreach Coordinator at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. We'll also hear from Tom Farr, President of the Religious Freedom Institute, and Samantha Hoffman, a visiting academic fellow at the Mercator Institute for China Studies and non-resident fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. So I want to thank you all for being here. The Chinese government, under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, has long imposed harsh policies against unregistered Christian churches, Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, Falun Gong practitioners, and other religious adherents. The Commission maintains a political prisoner database, and since that database was created, it has featured some 6,275 cases involving individuals detained because of their religion. Currently, there are more than 750 active cases and countless others whose names we will never know. The Commission consistently advocates for members of Congress and the administration to raise individual prisoner cases, and the database is an invaluable tool in that effort. Religious freedom in China is a vast topic, and we will only begin to scratch the surface of it today. But consider the following. Uyghur Muslims are rounded up and interned in camps. Tibetan monks and nuns are forced to undergo political re-education sessions. Falun Gong practitioners are reportedly sent to legal education centers for indoctrination. Churches are shuttered, crosses removed, and Christian believers harassed and imprisoned. These are the daily realities in Xi Jinping's China, and it leads many observers to describe the current wave of repression as the most severe since the Cultural Revolution. Even as the government has carried out an extensive campaign to ensure ideological loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party above all else, impacting various sectors of society, not the least of which are religious communities, it has also targeted those who represent and advocate for them. Not just the communities, but those who represent them and advocate for them. The 709 crackdown, as it was called, saw scores of rights lawyers and advocates detained, arrested, and tortured, forced to ingest unknown medications and confess to crimes that they did not commit. These brave men and women have been at the tip of the spear in representing China's repressed and persecuted Christians and Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, and Falun Gong practitioners. Of the rights lawyers who have courageously defended the rights of their fellow citizens in Chinese courts, several continue to serve sentences, including Wang Chengzheng, Zhang Tenyang, and Gao Zhu-sun, those who have independently documented the truth of Chinese citizens persecuted for their beliefs became targets of the persecution themselves. One fearless example is citizen journalist and human rights defender Huang Qi. We are extremely concerned that he is in danger of making the ultimate sacrifice for telling these stories because his government is currently deliberately denying him access to medical treatment while he is in prison. However, set against this grim backdrops, something remarkable has happened. The number of religious adherents in China has grown. This shows the utter failure of the Chinese Communist Party's policies in this regard. Today's hearing provides an opportunity to better understand the scale and the scope of the current crackdown, to identify cross-cutting trends across different religions, to examine the elevated role of the United Front Work Department, and what this means for China's faithful, and to put forward policy recommendations to address this crisis. This commission has been particularly seized this year with the ongoing crackdown in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, targeting Uyghurs and other ethnic minority Muslim groups. Our annual report that was released in October described these grave abuses at length, abuses which I believe, and most would agree, constitute crimes against humanity. During a July hearing on Xinjiang, we heard sobering testimony from Ms. Gulchera Ozha, a Radio Free Asia Uyghur Service journalist and an American citizen who had been personally impacted by the crackdown. Dozens of her own family members have been detained, have disappeared. And as sobering as her story is, she's not alone. Not only have her fellow Uyghur service journalists been similarly impacted, but countless other Americans have as well. It seems that every week the commission, which we chair, is contacted by Uyghurs living in the United States desperate for news about a loved one who has vanished into the growing labyrinth of camps. Today we are honored to have with us Ms. Tursun. Her story is harrowing, and we are truly grateful for her courage in coming forward. Also grabbing headlines in recent months is the growing repression facing Christians in China. Beijing authorities recently banned Zion Church, one of the largest unofficial Protestant churches in the city, which typically drew up to 1,600 worshipers on any given Sunday. Robbed of their worship space, members of the church have reportedly taken to quietly meeting in parks and in homes. In September, reports emerged of authorities burning Bibles and compelling Christians to sign papers renouncing their faith. Meanwhile, the Holy See and the Chinese government apparently have reached an agreement this fall, the precise details of which have not been made public. It has been reported that Beijing would now recognize the Pope as the head of the Catholic Church in China. The Vatican would recognize 7 excommunicated Chinese bishops appointed by the PRC authorities. The Chinese authorities would appoint future bishops, while the Pope would have veto power over their nomination. There is growing concern, rightfully so, that this agreement may put in greater peril those Catholic believers who maintain as part of their faith that they cannot and will not worship under clergy that have been selected by the Chinese government. There is also alarm that any deal betrays the memory of Catholics who refused to renounce papal supremacy and were persecuted for it, while demoralizing those who still stand faithful. As the hearing title denotes, the Communist Party is at the center of this crackdown. The party's Central Committee issued a massive restructuring plan for party and government agencies to be completed by the end of this calendar year. The United Front Work Department, which Xi Jinping, like Mao before him, calls the magic weapon of the Communist Party, was further empowered in this reorganization. This year, its role in overseeing religious affairs was expanded, underscoring the party's enduring fear that the growth of religious belief is a threat to their grip on power. As the party conducts United Front work to ensure that outside groups are in line with its agenda, the evidence is also clear that Chinese officials are only too willing to expand their repression overseas to intimidate and harass Americans and legal permanent residents of the United States, including those in the Uyghur community. Ms. Tursun's story reminds us that China's suppression of religious faith and religious communities is real. It is evil. It is too horrendous to ignore. In the 21st century, we must not, cannot, and should not accept the mass internment of individuals based on their religious faith, on the basis of their cultural identity, nor can we accept the efforts to stamp out all unofficial religious communities in China that maintain as a matter of faith that they do not want to be beholden to the leadership of the Chinese government or, frankly, any government. Now, without objection, I wanted now to turn it over to Congressman Smith, who's our co-chair, for his opening statement, and then I want to hear from our witnesses, and I want to thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The present-day assault on religion in China is the most comprehensive attempt to manipulate and control religious communities since the Cultural Revolution. What is happening under Xi Jinping's leadership is a systematic effort to transform, co-opt, or destroy the very nature of religious communities. Regulations on religious affairs issued in February tightened the existing restrictions, and new draft regulations will further clamp down on religious expression online. Churches, mosques, and temples have been demolished, crosses destroyed, children under the age of 18 are prohibited from attending services, and the Communist Party is now commissioning a new religious text that removes content unwanted by the atheistic Communist Party. Xi Jinping talks about realizing the China dream, but when Bibles are burned, when a simple prayer over a meal in public is an illegal religious gathering, and when over 1 million Uyghur and Kazakh Muslims are interned in political re-education camps, and forced to renounce their faith. That dream is an unmitigated nightmare. Xi Jinping's war on religion is also a distinct challenge to U.S. religious freedom diplomacy and to international standards on freedom of religion. There is a dire need to continue shining a light on the stunning and outrageous detention of nearly 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minorities. Senator Rubio and I have tried to be a voice for those repressed. Ms. Tursin's powerful testimony today reminds us that we cannot be silent when the Chinese government is constructing a high-tech police state in Xinjiang province, whose goal is the forced assimilation of an entire ethnic minority population and the sonification of their religious beliefs and practices. I do commend the administration, particularly Secretary Pompeo and Vice President Pence, for speaking out forcefully. I would urge the administration to support the bipartisan Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act that Senator Rubio and I introduced, and to sanction Chinese officials and businesses complicit in these crimes against humanity. In the past year, and it was referenced by our chairman, pressure has mounted on independent Protestant and Catholic churches. Clergy are now in prison. They have been, but even more so. Churches have been forcibly closed, and the human rights lawyers who defend religious believers have been jailed, disappeared, or tortured into silence. Gao Zhejiang, Yang Tingyong, and so many others have been disappeared, detained, and tortured for standing up against persecution. An open letter signed by over 500 Protestant leaders inspires and should motivate each and every one of us to double our efforts on behalf of those who are fighting this repression. In the midst of an intense campaign of repression, these 500 Protestant leaders wrote, and I quote, "For the sake of the gospel, we are willing to suffer all external losses brought about by unfair law enforcement. Out of a love for our fellow citizens, we are willing to give up all of our earthly rights. For the sake of the gospel, we are prepared to bear all losses, even the loss of our freedom and our lives." This type of courageous conviction that requires not only our admiration, but our action. Let me turn just for a brief moment to the issue of Catholicism in China, where a deal has been struck that will reportedly give the Pope veto power over Chinese government-approved candidates for bishops. Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin admits, quote, "It is not a good deal, but believes it is important to unify the underground Catholic Church and the state-sanctioned Catholic Patriotic Association." Cardinal Zen, however, Bishop Emeritus of Hong Kong, has questioned whether Vatican officials making these decisions, quote, "know what true suffering is." The reports are that the deal is provisional and full details are secret. However, the devil is in the details, including the fate of underground churches, the 30 underground bishops appointed previously over Beijing's objections, and Vatican relations with Taiwan. I would just note parenthetically that back in 1994, I met with Bishop Xu of Baoding Province. He celebrated Mass. He was out of prison just for a very brief time, was rearrested a few years later, and he spent probably about 40 years, at least 30 plus, in incarceration. He had absolutely no animosity to the Chinese state. He said, as a true Christian, I love them, I pray for them, even though they beat me. Bishop Xu of Baoding, an amazing man. He is one of those underground Catholic bishops, and as we all know, there are several others who are still being held in detention. I do hope and pray that this agreement will bring true religious freedom for Catholics in China, but I have my doubts. Since the agreement was reached, underground priests are detained, pilgrimage sites have been closed, crosses continue to be toppled from churches, formerly excommunicated bishops were welcomed in Rome, and the United Front department officials in October convened a re-education session for priests. So that's the harbinger of, I think, some very bad additional things to come. The President and Xi Jinping will meet, as we know, in Argentina this week, seeking ways to diffuse U.S.-China tensions. It should be conveyed to Xi Jinping in absolute clarity by our President that his war on religion is not only an egregious wrong against the Chinese people, It is also highly counterproductive strategy. Taking a hammer and sickle to the cross or jailing 1 million Muslims will not only ensure that a tougher China policy will be widespread, bipartisan, and even global support. We need to do more. This hearing, again, I think, helps us get further clarity so we can speak authoritatively and passionately on behalf of religious freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I want to begin with this. I read this testimony earlier, and it is, I want everybody to hear it. It's incredibly powerful. It's a testimony that we're about to hear from Ms. Tursun, and it's going to be translated. So I thank you for being here, for your bravery and courage in appearing, and for the great service you're doing to your fellow men and women in the world, and testifying today about reality of what's happening, what happened to you and what's happening to so many.
Marco Rubio Bandiga va Amerika hukumatiga ko'p rahmat sizlarga.
I would like to thank the United States government and the American people for saving my life and bringing me to America, the land of the free.
Meni inglizcham bak yaxshi bo'lmag'achqa tarjim qilib bersa.
Because my English is not good enough, I would like my translator to read my statement. This is a statement from Mehrigul. My name is Mehrigul Tursun. My name is Mehrigul Tursun, and I am 29 years old. I am a Uyghur. Over the last 3 years, I was taken to China's government detention centers 3 times. I spent a total of 10 months in the camps. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify about my personal experience. I ask that my written testimony be submitted for the record. In May 2015, I returned to China from Egypt, where I studied English. I was arrested at the airport, and my 2-month-old triplets were taken away. The officers handcuffed me, put a dark sack over my head, and took me to a detention center. After 3 months, they told me that I could be with my sick children until their health improved, and released me. My oldest son had died in their hands. In April 2017, I was taken to a detention center for the 2nd time. I was interrogated for 4 days and nights without sleep. After being in the camp for 3 months, I kept having seizures and losing consciousness. I was finally released to a mental hospital. From there, my father took me home, and I gradually recovered. In January 2018, I was detained for the 3rd time. They put chains on my wrists and ankles, put a black sack over my head, and took me to a hospital. I was stripped naked and put under a big computerized machine. Then I was dressed in a blue uniform with yellow vest, worn by serious criminals, and taken to a camp. Now I would like to tell you about what I experienced in these camps. I was taken to a cell, which was built underground with no windows. There were cameras on all 4 sides, so the officials could see every corner of the room. There were around 60 people in one of the cells where I was held. At night, 15 women would stand up while the rest of us would sleep sideways. And then we would rotate every 2 hours. Some people had not taken a shower in over a year. Before we ate breakfast, which was water with very little rice, we had to sing songs hailing the Communist Party. We had to repeat in Chinese, in quote, "Long live Xi Jinping," and in quote, "Lenience for those who repent and punishment for those who resist." Anyone who could not memorize a book of slogans and rules within 14 days would be denied food or beaten. Sometimes there was no food all day, and when there was food, it was mostly a steamed bun. They forced us to take unknown pills and drink some kind of white liquid. The pill caused us to lose consciousness and reduced our cognition level. The white liquid caused loss of menstruation in some women and extreme bleeding in others, and even death. I also experienced torture in a tiger chair the second time I was detained. I was taken to a special room and placed in a high chair. Bands held my arms and the legs in place and tightened when they pressed a button. The guards put a helmet on my shaved head. Each time I was electrocuted, my whole body would shake violently, and I could feel the pain in my veins. I thought I would rather die than go through this torture. I begged them to kill me. They insulted me with humiliating words and pressured me to admit my guilt. They told me my mother and the son had died. My father was serving life in prison, and that my family was torn apart because of me. In another cell where I was held, there were 40 women aged between 17 and 62. When I left the cell after about 3 months, there were 68. Most of them were educated professionals, such as teachers and doctors. I witnessed 9 deaths in my cell in 3 months. I cannot imagine how many deaths there must be in all the camps. In the camps, I met a 23-year-old woman named Patam Khan. Her crime was attending a wedding in 2014 that was held according to Islamic traditions, where people did not dance, sing, or drink alcohol. She said 400 people who attended that wedding were all taken to the camps. When she was taken, she had left her 2 kids in the field. She agonized every day about where her children were. One night, she suddenly dropped to the floor and stopped breathing. Several people with masks came and dragged her away. After more than 3 months in the camp, I came out and was again able to see my kids. Thanks to the help of many wonderful people, I was able to come to the United States. Words cannot describe how joyful I felt when I landed in Virginia 2 months ago. But I'm not completely free from my traumatic experience. And I fear that the Chinese government is still monitoring me. My brother recently left a voicemail on my cell phone. He said, in quote, "How could you do this to your parents? What kind of daughter are you? You should go to the Chinese embassy right away and denounce all the things you said about the Chinese government in the interviews you gave to the Radio Free Asia. And tell them you love China. Tell them you were pressured by the Uyghur organizations in the US to lie about your detention and the torture in the camps. And take back everything you said. Otherwise, China can get you wherever you hide." I'm trying to start a new life in America, go to school and take care of my son and daughter. But now I'm terrified that the Chinese government could still threaten me from so far away. Please protect the Uyghurs in America from the Chinese government's threats. Please help Uyghur refugees around the world who will be taken to the camps if they are forced to return to China. Please take action to save the people who are being tortured right now. I hope the US government will take a strong action against the officials responsible for torturing me, and the death of my little boy, and the death of so many innocent Uyghur people. My people look to the United States as a beacon of hope. It is the only country that can tell China to stop its ethnic cleansing of the Uyghur people. I still remember the words of the officers when I asked what my crime was. They said, in quote, being a Uyghur is a crime. Distinguished Congressman, and if you ever go to China, please ask where my mother, father, and siblings are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hoffman. Take the microphone, please.
Chairman Rubio, Chairman Smith, distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this topic of critical importance. I will begin with 4 observations about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party's crackdown on religion. First, the CCP's crimes against scapegoated religious groups are directed from the highest level of the Chinese Communist Party. The clearest central level authority directing these actions is the United Front Work Department of the CCP Central Committee. The United Front Work Department oversees ethnic affairs and, by definition of this role, is ultimately responsible for the concentration, internment, and re-education of predominantly Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. The United Front Work Department oversees religious affairs, and the effort Xi Jinping describes as at the 2015 Central United Front Work Department conference as persisting in the direction of Sinicization of religion in China. It is, by definition, not only responsible for the mass internment of Muslims in Xinjiang, but also the growing persecution of Christians and other religious groups in China. Number 2, the CCP's actions are linked to a state security strategy that prioritizes the protection and expansion of the CCP's power, not the protection of China with or without the CCP. The crackdown on religion is a visible manifestation of a much larger effort to defend the CCP's version of the truth. Embedded in the explanation for the Sinicization of religion is the closely related CCP concept of cultural security. Cultural security does not protect Chinese civilization. Instead, it aims to eliminate ideological threats that political opponents can be used, political opponents can use as vehicles to challenge the party. In reality, the CCP's claims to hold the truth may be more strongly contested by everyday social demands that, intentionally or not, expose falsehoods in the CCP's narrative. It is one likely reason why the party, in addition to religious communities, also sees, for instance, the women's rights movement or activities of student labor organizers in China as a threat. Beyond mobilization power, it exposes the CCP's false narrative that Chinese culture and the Chinese people are somehow different in regard to universal human rights. Third, the CCP's choice to employ language such as a people's war against religious extremism to describe its actions suggests the CCP is acting on a broader threat perception. This threat perception has always been present in the CCP's thinking, but the clearest sources of the present-day crackdown are the Falun Gong sit-in demonstration in 1999, where senior members of the Chinese Communist Party, including of the People's Armed Police and the PLA, were involved in using the same state security resources that were meant to protect the party to mobilize, and instead of using those against the group that they're supposed to mobilize against, actually being a part of that group. The color revolutions in Eastern and Central Asia during the early 2000s are another example. Making scapegoats of groups like Uyghurs or Christians or Tibetans, the CCP points to examples like color revolutions and jasmine revolutions, or even the velvet revolutions in Eastern Europe, to justify the tightening and expanding of its own power. The CCP warns that internal and external hostile forces seek to infiltrate political parties, religious and ethnic groups, and incite divisions in Chinese society. The anxiety is aimed at shoring up loyalty within the party and convincing Chinese society of their need for the party's paternalism. Finally, the root cause of the CCP's actions are not the victims of its aggression. The victims are scapegoats used to mask the CCP's core weaknesses and to justify the expansion of the CCP's unchecked power. The core weaknesses are the unending contestation for power within the party and the party's struggle to maintain control over China's narrative. These weaknesses do not make the CCP's failure inevitable. In fact, As the CCP's victims in Xinjiang have learned, this combination of strength and weakness can be catastrophic. So, if you take one point away from my testimony today, it's that in order to help the victims in Xinjiang and help other persecuted religious groups in China, we need to think broader than those groups themselves. And that means that the committee needs to think about long-term responses. And I don't have those answers for you today. But what I can offer you are short-term solutions that can at least help to stall the CCP's progress. First, a strong response to the CCP's persecution of religious groups must address the problem at its core. Individuals, namely in Xinjiang, such as Party Secretary Chen Quanguo, are directly implementing the CCP's securitization policies in Xinjiang should be immediately sanctioned. Sanctions should not, however, end at the local and regional levels of government. Beyond the actual source of the problem is a broader state security strategy that is clearly centrally directed. The U.S. government should start by targeting all officials connected to the control of religions. This includes known members of the State Ethnic Affairs Commission, the Central Xinjiang Work Coordinating Leading Small Group Office, and high-level officials in the United Front Work Department. I've listed several specific individuals in my written testimony. Second, sanctions should also extend to both Chinese and international companies that are involved in the construction of the Chinese surveillance state, which support the CCP's human rights violations. It's not a complete solution, but it could stall progress, CCP's progress, and buy time while policymakers research more long-term effective policies. And I would just add that if anyone is concerned about economic damage to U.S. companies, that line would put a monetary price on human life. Finally, overseas Chinese communities must be protected. Western governments must take steps to protect overseas Chinese from all kinds of CCP encroachment that have taken place for decades, but are now increasingly augmented and drawn to our attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Farr.
Chairman Rubio, Co-Chairman Smith, Mr. King, thank you for holding this important hearing. Before I begin, let me say that after hearing the testimony of the brave Ms. Turson, no one can doubt the evil of the regime we are here to discuss. Thank you for inviting me to give my views on the Vatican's provisional agreement with that regime. It's noteworthy that this Sino-Vatican agreement was concluded amid the most systematic and brutal attempt to control Chinese religious communities since the Cultural Revolution. President Xi Jinping's strategy includes persecution intended to alter the fundamental nature of at least three religions. One is Islam, as practiced by the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, which we've heard about. Another is Tibetan Buddhism, the object for decades of a brutal Chinese strategy of violence and cultural destruction. A third is Roman Catholicism, whose distinctive teachings on human rights and religious freedom for all people pose a particular obstacle to the Chinese state, especially to the Marxist-Leninist understanding of religion, human nature, and human dignity. I want to explore the possible effects of the provisional agreement on what is a very dangerous moment for Catholics in China. The Vatican's primary goal is said to be that of unifying Chinese Catholics by approving bishops who are in communion with Rome, but at the same time recognized by Chinese authorities. Other objectives are said to include reducing Chinese persecution of Catholics. These are worthy goals, but it's difficult to see how the agreement will achieve them or help achieve them. Beijing has spent decades attempting to manipulate and control the Catholic Church, especially through the government-controlled Catholic patriotic associations. Those Catholics who remain loyal to the magisterium of the Church, the Holy Father, and fundamental Catholic teachings on human dignity and human rights are part of an underground church, whose adherents are subject to arrest, torture, and disappearance. Unfortunately, although the agreement is only 2 months old, there are already signs that its provisions will exacerbate this divide rather than heal it. The text of the agreement, as Mr. Smith said, has not been made public, but its contours are generally known. Chinese Catholic bishops will now be chosen in a process that begins with local, communist-controlled Catholic patriotic associations presenting the names of candidates to dioceses where a vacancy for a bishopric occurs. Diocesan priests and lay Catholics will then vote on the candidates. The winner's name will be sent to the government-controlled Council of Bishops, who will then provide the name to the Vatican. There, the candidate could either be accepted or rejected by the Pope. The Vatican apparently hopes that the Pope's veto power will ensure the orthodoxy of the new bishops and facilitate reconciliation among China's divided Catholics. Unfortunately, it seems to me highly unlikely that a Chinese-controlled council of bishops will forward to the Vatican the name of a bishop candidate who is a faithful Catholic. A man chosen in this process is unlikely to be a witness to the truths proclaimed by the Church about, for example, the sanctity of life, human dignity, or religious freedom for everyone. It seems far more likely that the name of a candidate bishop sent to Rome will be chosen for his acquiescence to the communist regime, if not for his fidelity to its anti-Catholic purposes. Of course, the Pope can veto such candidates, but for how long? Vacancies in bishoprics do not harm the Chinese government. They harm Chinese Catholics. The insidious effects of this bargain may already have shown themselves. 2 official Chinese bishops attended the recent Synod on Youth in Rome, as Mr. Smith mentioned, apparently at the invitation of Pope Francis. But these bishops were and are communist apparatchiks. They are both leaders of the aforementioned Council of Bishops, controlled by the government. Unaccountably, the 2 left Rome before the Synod was finished. Perhaps, Mr. Smith, they left to preside over the re-education classes for priests you mentioned. Whatever the cause of their abrupt departure, it was not the act of bishops faithful to the Holy Father or the Catholic Church. Unfortunately, the persecution of Chinese Catholics has not decreased. If anything, it's intensified since the signing of the agreement. Mr. Smith gave a couple of examples. Let me mention also that within a month of the signing of the agreement, 2 Marian shrines had been destroyed by communist officials in China. Unfortunately, the Sino-Vatican agreement seems to mirror the Vatican's failed Cold War diplomacy of the 1960s, which was frankly unrealistic about the evil of communism and deeply wounded the Church in parts of Eastern Europe. On the other hand, the Vatican does have a distinct moral authority to counter the root causes of totalitarian evil, just as Pope John Paul II did in the 1980s in collaboration with President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher. In my view, the Holy See's role should be now, as it was then, to press for human rights, and especially for religious freedom for all the religious communities in China and elsewhere. Given the current vile assaults on Uyghur Muslims and Tibetan Buddhists, the Vatican should be standing with them. As for China's Catholics, the Vatican should demand nothing less than libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the Church to witness to its adherents, to the public, and to the regime, its teachings on human dignity and the common good. I sincerely hope I'm wrong about the long-term effects of the Sino-Vatican agreement, but I don't believe it will help the Roman Catholic Church, China's Catholic minority, or certainly the cause of religious freedom in China. The Chinese know what they are doing. The Vatican's charism in China, on the other hand, is not diplomacy, but witness to the truth about God and man. Thanks for inviting me to address this important topic.
Thank you all for being here. I'm going to now turn it to, we have a vote at 4 o'clock. I'll stay with, we'll have a few minutes after 4 to continue, and obviously the co-chair is here, but I wanted to give Senator King a chance at the first question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank our witnesses for moving and important testimony. It's rare that we have an opportunity to hear so directly about something like this that is so abhorrent and so at variance. In fact, it's almost impossible for us to understand where freedom of religion is a basic premise of our entire society. And that leads me to my first question, and maybe Mr. Farr, you could tackle this. Why are they doing this? Why would a country that has a great culture and history and tradition and strength and a lot of entrepreneurship, and why are they being so cruel to relatively small groups that would appear, at least, to be not a major threat to the endurance of the regime? Why are they going out of their way to do something which is bound to bring down upon them the opprobrium of the world?
It's a good question, Senator, and a big question. Let me give you what I think, to cut to the chase, is the answer. Religion threatens communism. Communism is a totalitarian understanding of the world, of what a human being is. Most religions posit an authority greater than the state. This is a threat to the state, which is one reason we have this in the First Amendment to our Constitution. Our founders wanted to limit the power of the state by protecting the right of people to have a fidelity to something that's more important than government. Communism is precisely the opposite of this. So I think religion, by its nature, threatens them, particularly those religions that have reasons for fidelity to a greater authority. Certainly, to stick to what I was talking about today, but I think it's true of our other witnesses as well, the Catholic Church is distinguished by its adherence to not only the authority beyond the state, but to the right of everybody, every citizen in a state, to have religious freedom. That's a threat to the regime. I think that's the answer to your question, although it's more complicated than that, but I think that's the core answer.
It just seems that it's a disproportionate response to what is a relatively small threat, given the numbers of people that we're
If I might just add, sir, the threat, quotes around that, is growing because people are converting to religion in China. There is one estimate, speaking here about Christians, that there will be, that within 20 years, China will have more Christians than any other country in the world. Wow. This scares the dickens out of the Chinese.
Ms. Turson, let me ask you a variation of the same question. Why do you think you were treated so abominably? What threat did you present to the government of China?
Siz qanday qaraysiz deydi. Nemishki siz shaxsan bir Uyg'ur nemingiz bilan u Xitoy siz nim tahdid qilyapsiz, ular sizni u qadar besim qilg'idak, sizga u qadar sizga jazolaydi.
Nimaga qanday qarayman? Tushundiraman.
Xitoy hukumati nima uchun sizga u qadar besim qiladi? Siz bir Uyg'ur sifatingizda Xitoy hukumatiga nim tahdid qilishingiz mumkin.
Chunki Xitoyda unda besim uchirgan menlam emas, faqat bizning vatandaşlarning hammasi ashundoq. Faqat men bir tipik vakili uning ichidagi.
In China, the facing religious persecution is not only just myself. I'm just one very simple representative of many.
But why
many
is my
people.
question.
Chunki biz ashizmning egisi bo'lganlik uchun, chunki biz Sharq Turkistonning egisi bo'lganligimiz uchun.
Just because of we are owners of that land, the land belong to us.
Let me ask another question, Ms. Hoffman. You talked about some kind of response. Is the United States responding in any concrete way today to this this gross violation of human rights? Are there sanctions in place? Are there high-level discussions, negotiations, anything? Is there any, are we doing anything about this, is my question.
I think just to first add to your first question, in order to answer that question, the root causes of what the CCP is doing in Xinjiang and elsewhere are the party's weaknesses. It's the contestation for power within the party that's unending. It's the party's fear of loss of narrative control. And so it scapegoats groups like the Uyghurs to justify shoring up loyalty within the party, as well as to justify to the people their need for the party's control. So I think that while it's important that the U.S. government has certainly called attention to the issue in Xinjiang, I think that the U.S. government needs to be thinking longer term and broader.
But have we imposed any Magnitsky Act sanctions anything of that nature?
I believe one, yes, one. But I think that sanctions need to go to the highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party. But that's only a starting point. Solving the problem is thinking long term. And I don't know that the U.S. government is doing that yet.
A 19th century philosopher said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we may be seeing that playing out before our eyes when there are no essential checks and balances. This is unfortunately a part of human nature. Thank you all for your testimony, and I appreciate your being here today.
Thank you, Senator King. I wanted to, first of all, Ms. Turson, I wanted to thank you for coming. I know I could see how difficult the testimony was for you. And I want you to know, and I won't, for purposes of not making this any more difficult for you, I do have here pictures that you've submitted for us of your family and of your 3 children. And we're going to submit those for the record, if that's okay, so that it could be part of the committee's record on this hearing, along with your testimony.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, please.
And I want others who are here, I can see people holding up pictures and articles about your loved ones who are unaccounted for. And I want you to know we see that. And if we were to, just the sheer volume, the number of cases and individuals who have gone through this is so massive that it would take forever to document it. But none of them are forgotten. The reason why we spend, this is I believe our 4th hearing with other activity that we've done. And but today you've been their voice, Ms. Turson. And I wanted to thank you for that. I have 3 questions that I hope you can address. The first is, you testified briefly about fear, that even here in the United States you're being watched, harassed, and followed. That is disturbing to us, that in someone living in this country, the Chinese government could try to intimidate, whether it be through phone calls or other activity that you described in your written testimony. The first is, we obviously will talk to you after this to ensure that appropriate law enforcement authorities are aware of this, to ensure that nothing that you are will be safe in this country, and that nothing happens, and anyone knows that if anything were to ever happen, we knew who did it. We think is the strongest form of protection. You deserve that. But I wanted you, if you could briefly describe, have you had any incidents recently where you feel, not just a phone call, but individuals have followed you or have felt suspicious that you have been in any way the target of harassment, potentially by those working on behalf of the Chinese government?
Sizniki yazma şahitnamanızda siz şundaq depsiz mesela hatta hazır Amerikada bolsanız özünüzde hiç bir bexatar his qılmaganlığınız haqida siz mümkün bolsa qısqa aldı bizga tasvirlab bersangiz bu yaqin vaqtda siz telefon orqali emas yoki o'zingiz siz gumondor bo'lgan ba'zi bir insonlarni shu Xitoy hukumatiga ishlaydigan Xitoy tarafdan ba'zi bir insonlarning sizga mishda tahdidlagan yoki sizga mishda bir vahim solgan shunday ahvollar bo'ldimi? Qisqa shuni tasvirlab bersangiz.
Amerikaga kelgandan keyin bizning uydagilardan dadam, akam, apamlardan tahdid kelgandan boshqa yana 2 xil g'ayri nomerdan telefon keldi, men olamadim.
Since I came to America, other than that kind of pressure that I have received from my family members, like my father and the brother's text messages, and also another 2 suspicious phone calls.
Аны кейін бір қатым шу Вирджиниядагы маркеттен айланып өйгө кайташымда ол бір тузап маңганда шу бір кар көз айнектик кар шеп кийген шу Xitay чырай birisi kendimden düşüp maşın bilen qoğlap bir vəgi çık qoğuldu. Eynəkini düşürüp qıldı, lekin mən qoğuq ketdim keyin maşını tozla qaraldı. Mən başqa yol qayırlı ketdim. İşkep daldı da.
About 2 weeks ago, in one of the markets in Virginia, I was catching an Uber and traveling, and I felt that some person who wearing black glasses,
Black qarıça şep kiygen qarı
and also black hat, and that person was with the car, and then he was trying to talk to me through the windows of the car. And the car drove through the different direction. We dropped him, and I scared when he tried to talk to me through the window.
And then driver asked me, "You know him?" I said, "No, I don't know." But I see he is Chinese. I understand. And I let driver go fast, help me to run away, and then they go another way, and this driver keep me in my house. But I'm always worried. All the time I don't feeling I'm safe here. China embassy.
Yes, I mean, probably I just repeat. I don't feel safe here. I don't feel safe here because I always worry that person. Soon I told the driver to just drive away, and then we were able to leave that person. But I always feel I don't feel safe here, even in Miami. Like for example, she's just mentioning about this article she brought, and it is from Global Times. In that article specifically, they mentioned her name, saying that what she said and what she, the interview that she has given to Radio Free Asia and everything is lie. And that report says that the report of Global Times recently reported from one of the re-education camps of Xinjiang that the situation, the reporter described it completely different. And it says that what Tursun portrayed or described about the camps is even that kind of situation doesn't exist in Chinese prison. So this is another threat that she felt directly from the Chinese government, which is specifically mentioning her name in the article.
The second question I have is, in your time in camp, were you ever forced to perform work or labor, any forced labor?
Siz aşı lagerda vaqtыңızda sizni mecburi emgek qildimu? Undaq mecburlap bir ishlarni emgek qilishga saldımı?
Yo'q, bizni u yerdan chiqartmaydi. Bir uyning ichidan havo chiqishga chiqartmaydi.
No, they don't allow us to go out from the room. They just to lock us in the room. They don't allow us to be out.
So in her detainment, she wasn't even allowed to go out, and even they were basically detained in a sort of confinement with a handful of other people, some of whom died.
Siz müşündakılık bir türmedekiler müştak cep başkalar bilen solaklı koygan solakta, o solakta mümkün şu solakta başkalarının ölgenligini gördünüz mü? Aşındak solak mı o emse?
Mana shu bir kameraga solaymiz, solaydi, bizlarni sirtqa havolantirishga harakatga chiqmaydi. Shu ash kameraning ichiga tarat qilamiz, ashada o'rtirib uxlasaqmi, ashada o'rtirib bir narsa yodlasaqmi, ashada. Andan shu o'lib qolganlarmi shu mening ko'z oldimda 9 o'likka men shahid bo'ldim.
It is a cell. We've been locked up with many other people, and if we read something, we do it here. If we go to bathroom, toilet, we do it in the same place. If we stay, we just stay together. I mean, if people dies, it dies among us, and then I have witnessed 9 people to die in front of me.
There have been reports in the press about the forced collection of DNA from people throughout China, but particularly in the Xinjiang region. Some of it under the guise of a physical exam, others forced to provide blood samples and so forth as part of getting passports. In your time there, whether it was getting the passport, are you aware of these forced efforts to make people undergo physical exams, give blood samples, and other? Was that something you were subjected to, either in confinement or when you applied with the authorities on entry or on exit?
Siz aşı vatandaşlara veyle aşı türmede bolan, solaqta bolan, mayli yak sırtı bolan, Xitaylı Uygurlarniki her vaqtılqa DNA nemisini əvrişkisini iləvatqan aşında ahvallar bolğan. O DNA əvrişkisini alğanda bəzilərini sizin qan təkşirəyimiz degan yollar bilan, bəzilərini sizlərni jismani salomatlik təkşirəyimiz degan yollar bilan və yoki bəzilərini pasportlarını işləsə yoki bir materiallarını almız desə, şu materiallarını elişqi bir şərt qılğan əsasda aşında qılıb DNA əvrişkisini alğan aşında ahvallar bolğan. Siz muşundaqları şahit boldunuzmu yoki siz muşunda işlərni siz gördünüzmü yoki sizin başınızdan ötdümü?
Mən aşılar şahit boldum. Bu lekin o pasport beceriş 2015'ten burunqi aşında bazı adamlardan aşında qanalarken, lekin 2015'ten başlap hazır kadar bu mecburi. Doğulup bir aylıq bolğan bu vaqtdan yaş adamların hammasi, qari yaşın hammasi çuqum her bir rayonda öztürüşlük rayonunki aile komitetiga berip hamma adamdan oxşaş qanaldı hazır. Pasport bolsun, bolmasun, turmunun içide bolsun, turmunun teşide bolsun, xizmetçiler bolsun, hamma adam 100%. Onu butunlay amallaştırıp boldu 2017-yili 10 ayda.
Yes, I have witnessed that kind of practices, taking out the blood sample and doing DNA tests. Before 2015, when you apply for passport, that was one of the requirements that you do have to have a blood test. And after 2015, doing blood tests and DNA tests, everything became compulsory. That compulsory practice applied to from 1 month old baby up until whatever age. So everybody required to do blood tests as well as DNA sampling.
And you may or may not have any reason to know this, but the authorities who have compelled the turning over of DNA of everyone a few months ago put out a contract and for DNA sequencers to be able to account for all of this and creating this massive database. And I regret it's a great shame that one of the companies who has provided those DNA sequencers and frankly takes great pride in the work they do is an American company, Thermo Fisher Scientific, who just recently appeared in an article discussing what a great leader Xi Jinping is, which I imagine from their perspective is driven by the money they're making in that marketplace. And it gets to the broader issue of calling out these American companies who are participating and assisting them in the compulsory collection of DNA for purposes of collecting this massive database against the consent or absent the consent or even the knowledge of the people it's being collected from. And I apologize because I do have a vote and the co-chairman's here and is going to handle, he's got questions. I only wanted to, Dr. Hoffman and Farr, I wanted to just basically say that it seems to me that at the core of all this is an obsessive desire on the part of the Chinese government, which is not new, to create a sort of unified national identity which must be stripped of anything that competes with it. Ethnicity, religion, ethnic cultural tradition. There can be nothing that competes with it, and they appear, as they have been in the past, to be extremely ruthless in their willingness to stamp that out at any cost, whether it's in Tibet or Xinjiang or any other part of their country. And I would add to that in addition to that willingness to stamp out anything that competes with the party for people's loyalties or this national identity, is that when they use terms like extremism and they use terms like dangerous, what they mean by those terms is not violence or advocacy of violence. What they mean by extremist is you don't agree with them, or you have loyalties to God or loyalties to a culture or an identity that is not the one they want you to have. Is that an accurate assessment of what their goal is? Is that an accurate assessment of how they define extremism and dangerous?
It's fairly accurate. The Chinese Communist Party, its concept of what we would call national security, I think is better translated as party state security. And party state security is fundamentally about protecting the Chinese Communist Party. And that means that there are dimensions that are dealing with the internal struggle for power within the party, and then dealing with everything outside of the party, controlling the narrative, controlling the ideological space to ensure that the Chinese Communist Party can stay in power. And that means that these state security methods extend far beyond China's borders. And that's why you see the harassment of overseas Chinese, things like the social credit system, to try to essentially ensure that people can manage themselves to adhere to the party's will. It's a long-term process that's not new under Xi Jinping. It's something that the party's been doing forever. The changes at the beginning of the reform era were that the Chinese Communist Party can no longer rely on ideological mobilization alone. And then it had to come up with new ways for enabling Mao's mass line, essentially the idea that that's essentially the idea that the party shapes and manages how people behave. So it's in using things like the surveillance state to attach political control to economic and social development. I hope that answers your question.
I think you're exactly right, Senator. I think the Chinese are no different than the other totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. They want to label as extremist anything that challenges them. And just two things that I would cite as evidence. One is bringing the State Administration for Religious Affairs, which has been there in one guise or another for a long time, closer to the Politburo under the United Front Work Department. But also the fact that parents can be given criminal sanctions if they allow their children, any parent in China, if they allow their children to be exposed to religious education. That just tells you everything you need to know. They are afraid that their citizens are going to be infected with the virus of religion. So this is why Mao tried to destroy it. His successors know they can't destroy it, but they're going to try to manage and control, and I think Xi is simply the harshest of all the post-Mao presidents of China in doing this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, Ms. Turson, if I could just ask you first. Again, in reading your testimony, it is very compelling. It shows tremendous courage. And again, all of us on this commission are deeply grateful that you have decided to come here and to bear witness so courageously. You did talk about 68 women in that small cell block, 430 square feet. You mentioned that there were people there who had not taken a shower for a year, suggesting that they were in that terrible cell block for a year or more. You also spoke about the torture, and that you did mention that 9 women had died while you were there during those 3 months. And I'm wondering if you could explain to us how those women died. Was it sickness? Was it depression? Was it beatings? And the torture, what was it that they were interrogating you about when they tortured you? And again, to underscore the barbarity of the Chinese dictatorship, in this case, how they have grossly mistreated Uyghur Muslims, could you, to some extent, explain that torture? You talked about the tiger chair. In this commission, we have had hearings in the past where that hideous chair has been described in terrible detail. Were other women subjected to that same mistreatment? If you could.
Thank you. Deydiçi, siz dediniz deydi, mesela küçük bir aşı solaqtı 68 ayal bir aşında hayatlık dep, onunki naydı küçük yani 203 square feet. Ondan keyin bir yıl hatta bazı jünmağan aşağıda dep şu gapdan dediniz. Bir yılgacha tushunibman. Ondan keyin qiyin qisdaq bo'lganda hatta men 9 ayalninki o'lib ketganiga shohid bo'ldim deb dediniz. Hamda bu yerga savol, o'sha o'lib ketganlar og'riqdimi yoki qiyin qisdaqdimi, nima sababdan o'lib ketganligini bilamsiz? Ondan keyin qiyin qisdaq ahvolini dedingiz, masalan, egiz o'rindiqda o'tag'izib qiyin qisdaq elish degandek. Şu ahvollarni deb bas qilmasdan shu ayollar nima sabablardan o'lib ketdi, qiyin qisdaq deganda qanday tariqatga qiyin qisdaqlarni beshingizni o'tkazdingiz?
Men aldı bilan 62 yoshlik Gulnisaxonning o'lib ketganini shahid bo'ldim. U ayol kirgilib 1 yildan oshgankan men borganda.
The first of all, I would like to tell you about 62 years old Gulnisaxon. Her death. When I was detained in that cell, it's been 1 year for her to be held in that camp. I mean, in that room. Cell.
O ayolning qon besim, ondan keyin ashqazonda masala bor, burundan tatib xiljiq kasallar bor ekan to'q.
And that woman, she had blood pressure as well as she has problems with her digestional system.
Qon besim to'g'riliq burun dori yedi ekan to'q kunda, ammo turmoq kirgandan keyin hech qanday dorisini bermabdi.
She used to take blood pressure medicine when she wasn't detained before, but since she was detained, she didn't took her medicine.
Ammo men o ayolni ko'rganda yuzlari, put-qo'llari bek ishib ketgan, butun badaniga qizil bir narsa chiqib ketgan holat ekan. Hech qaysimiz uning qishiga yaqin baramaydik, kesli yo'q qamiz undab.
When I saw that lady, and her whole body was swollen, and also she had some kind of red spots on her body. Many of us didn't came close to her because we thought that we might catch her sickness.
Shundaqdimi yana biz bilan o'xshash o'rtirolmaydi, lekin o'rtimizmi o'ltirib turib biz bilan teng harakat qiladi.
And she wasn't able to stand sometimes, but still she would do something by sitting.
Shunda holatdimi men borgan shu 3 oy jarayonida u ayolni doktorxonaga qat'iy tekshirishga olmadi. Biz doktorxonaga tekshirishga olishni talab qildik, lekin biznikiga qig'il qo'ymadi.
And within the 3 months that I have stayed with her in that cell, and she wasn't treated at all. Nobody took her to see doctor or treatment. And we raised the issue and we demanded that if it's possible for her to see doctor, but they didn't listen to us.
O o'lib qolgan shu kunninki atganda boshqa turma saqchilarning bek haqorat tillarini anglab kecha yig'lab qoldi, yig'lab yotdi. Shu atisi o'lib qolgan shu muzdaqada qayerdan o'liga chiqdi.
And before one day that she passed away, and the cell officials really kind of abused her, used very bad language to abuse her, and she was crying from that abuse, and she cried, and that's how she passed away next day.
And başqa ayollar ham qiynashdan bo'ldi, ba'zini chunki u yerda to'qmaga, masalan meningki 2017-yili chechimni tushirib etib to'q chatdi.
And some of the women, they have died because of torture. For example, in 2017, they shaved my hair.
Chechimni qirib etib to'q chatdi. Qattiq urg'anlikdan bir qo'lim anglamas bo'lib qoldi, anglamaydi.
And also they shaved my hair as well as electrocuted me, and they beat me. That's why I don't really hear properly from my right ears. I can't hear.
Unda urgandan qon ko'p chiqib, ba'zi ayollarning qo'saqlari qismiga dastash, ba'zilarini lekin meni istiqtaltib baqimda istiqtaltadiganlar bor ekan.
And also sometimes the officers, they beat women, especially they beat on stomach of the woman, and some women will die because of the bleeding.
And even I heard that they use dogs to beat and use dogs to torture as well. I heard it, but I didn't witness that.
While you're speaking, are the torturers men or women or both? And is there sexual abuse?
All is men. All is men.
The man tortures woman,
Not in woman, not woman.
not woman. The man tortures woman.
Lekin mundaq basqınçılık qalan işte ahvallarmı barmı işte bolganmı deydi.
Men unda ahvallarni ko'rib bakmadım.
Yeah, I didn't witness sexual abuse, but I witnessed torture.
Amma ular shu butun kiyimni saldırıp qilgan salatda erlar tekshiraydi o ayollarni.
But another abusive thing is they ask us to take off all our clothes. They put us naked. The man does that.
Ana shu qattiq urushlar aylanib ketgandan keyin suv chechib yana o'sha keltirdi. Menga ikki qatam do'rib, mana qilqim. Aylantirib, so'roq soldi. Ularning nimaligini esimda yo'q.
And also they beat you, and then when you unconscious, and they pour water over you, and then make you come back again, and then they beat. All does by men. And like they give kind of medicine, and when we take a medicine, sorry.
To'g'ri yegandan keyin shu alqimda xonjoda kesat bo'ldi, lekin
And then they give kind of medicine. When you take that medicine, you feel like you're hallucinating. You don't like feel yourself.
urdi, lekin o sezim bo'lmaydi odamga.
And after that, after you take that medicine, when they beat you, you don't feel that beat. You don't feel hurt, or you don't feel anything.
Do they insult the Prophet Muhammad and your faith?
Sizning oldingizda turib, shu sizlarning oldinglarda turib, shu payg'ambarimiz Muhammad alayhisalomni depsand qilgan işte ahvollar bo'ldimi?
Yeah.
Yes.
Because last time when they beat me so hard, and then I tell him, please kill me, and then God will help you. Please kill me. So he say, where's your God? Tell him, come here, listen to me. They speak like this.
Right. I have some additional questions for you and for the other witnesses, but Senator Daines does have an appointment that he has to be at, so I'd like to yield such time as he may consume.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, as well as to Chairman Rubio. Thanks for holding this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for coming today. I want to thank Ms. Thurston for her bravery and her courage for being here today, especially. I spent more than a half a decade in China working in the private sector back in the 1990s. In fact, our two youngest children were born in Hong Kong. I've led congressional delegation visits to China the last 3 years. I've traveled to places beyond the regular places you go. Of course, we visit Beijing and places like Shanghai and Shenzhen, Hangzhou, but also we've gone to some of the places somewhat further away, to Urumqi, where we saw the prominent Uyghur Muslim populations, to Tibet, where we saw their Buddhist populations and the monks, to Dandong on the North Korean border. So we've seen the Muslim people there in China, we've seen the Buddhist monks in China, we've seen the Christians there in China, and it's allowed me to see firsthand some of the human rights abuses, the censorship, and the challenges the Chinese people face, as well as the efforts that are being made to extend influence beyond the borders of China. As your testimonies, this commission, the State Department Human Rights Report, and numerous others indicate, the state of religious freedom in much of China is in dire straits. It is critically important that we as a nation, founded on freedom, the rule of law, the basic foundation rights of religious liberty, that we bring our influence to bear to advance human rights in China and around the world. Dr. Hoffman, I have a question for you. Are there particular tools or technologies that might be helpful for the U.S. government or NGOs to support, to assist the persecuted populations in places like Xinjiang province or elsewhere in China?
On the technologies question, I haven't thought about it from that perspective, so I'll have to maybe add that to my written testimony later and think about the answer to that. But I think the number one thing is to really think about the problem at its source. Religious persecution is a symptom, it's not the cause. And the cause is the Chinese Communist Party. And I'm not quite sure that, and I said this in my testimony and I'll just repeat it, I'm not quite sure that we're thinking long-term enough. And what happens the day that maybe the Chinese Communist Party isn't in power. We aren't prepared for that day. And I think in order to help the Chinese people, we need to think about those kinds of questions, but it's a hard question to answer, so I'm not sure that I can give you a good answer today, but I think that there needs to be some kind of task force to think about these questions. And in terms of protection of certain groups, I'd like to point out one thing I've come across in my research is something like the social credit system, for instance, how that extends overseas. That's not new. You've heard it in the testimonies today, but it's also something that the CCP has done for decades, that they extend their control beyond China's borders, going back to, I know stories, particular stories going back to the 1950s and 60s. I've heard stories from people, which I won't repeat today because they're confidential, but stories where people are harassed. They've got citizenship in a democratic country, but they still have family back in China, or they have family in a democratic country without citizenship, and those members are harassed. And there's things that we can be doing to protect them. There's Chinese embassy officials going into businesses and telling people to install surveillance technology and then give them that information to feed that back to them, the embassy. And it's not that the U.S. government can help everybody. We need to know that the problems exist in the first place, but we need to create the conditions to allow people to report and feel comfortable reporting these problems. And going back to, I think I started to mention the social credit system, one thing I've come across is that the Ministry of Public Security is developing unified social credit codes for overseas Chinese as well. And that means the existing methods for control, what's been described, the harassment of overseas Chinese, the existing methods of control will just be augmented through a system like this. So we need to be thinking about how to, for instance, sanction tech companies that are involved in the development of the surveillance state, including things like smart cities, because a smart city in China isn't what a smart city is in the West. The same technologies that are used to say address problems like traffic management or food and health safety are the same technologies that are used to exert the party's control. And so I think part of the problem is that dual use has a new meaning, and we really need to think about those problems and the longer term solutions.
So Dr. Hoffman, when you think about the influences extending beyond the borders to Chinese who are here in the United States, Uyghurs here in the U.S., what are you seeing in terms of that long reach, whether it's through technology or other means here to gather intelligence, surveillance capabilities on those who might be living abroad?
Again, it's not a new technique. I know of a story of somebody in India in the 1960s who was harassed and beaten up so severely that they were permanently crippled and I think partly blind the rest of their life because they were running a Chinese language newspaper that the CCP had problems with this particular individual. And I know of cases, like I mentioned, of students overseas who have written on their WeChat, Xi Jinping is not my president, and have had embassy visits or either to them or local officials to their families back home. But it's not just those things. That's a relatively small number of cases. Sometimes it's just something as simple as overseas student groups knowing that the CCP is present. So overseas, a lot of my research focuses on this concept called social management. And social management is a combination of a cooperative and coercive control, which means that it's not just the CCP using coercive tactics, it's also the CCP providing services. So something like a Chinese Student and Scholars Association is mostly a service for students, but it's also the CCP just quietly sitting there and saying, hi, we're present. And every once in a while, they made that presence more known. But for the most part, it's just the CCP kind of expanding or just allowing overseas Chinese to know that the same rules apply to them abroad as they do at home.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman. I wanted to finish up my questions with Ms. Tursun. Could you provide any insight into how the Han residents of Xinjiang regard the treatment of the Uyghur population?
Біздің ватандагы уйгырлар учурап карашка Кытайлар кандай карашты демекчими? Уйгырлар.
Bizning Şinjanda, bizning vatanda turib atgan Xitoylar, Xitoy hökumətinin uyg'urlarga bo'lgan muomalasiga nisbatan qanday ko'z qarashda, qanday muomala qilishini qanday qaraydi Xitoy xalqi, hukumat emas Xitoy.
What I say. Bizni adamchilik, hayvonchilikmi ko'maydi. Bizni hayvonchilikmi ko'maydi ular. Chunki cho'mganda hayvonlarmi xil bir
They don't respect us like they even respect an animal. We don't receive any respect from them.
They can speak bad for us, we cannot. They can beat us, we cannot. If even parayga o'chratib tursak, bankka, doktorxona bo'lsin, o'chratib tursak, 10 odam 10 Uyg'ur oldida turgan bo'lsa, Xitoydan birisi kelsa, chuqum oldida turib, Xitoyning bijirib bo'lgan ekan, Uyg'urlar kirish kerak.
The treatment is very different because, like, for example, I can say that if we are lining up for getting something, if 10 Uyghurs standing on the line in front, if one Chinese comes, the service person will serve the one Chinese who came first. The 10 Uyghur will be left out.
Yeah, and then for example, from my house, I go out from my house. I go to supermarket normal, 2 meal. From this 2 meal inside, I must be, the Chinese police must check me 3-4 times. If
I wish to go out from my house, like 2-3 miles, I need to go through for checking at least 2-3-4 times.
So if it's a non-Uyghur, right? If it's a Han Chinese, no, they aren't the
but
checks.
But for Han Chinese, they don't do that. They don't. Yeah. They are not required to go through the checks. They are free. We always go through the scan, the scanning system. Always, that's the requirement for the Uyghurs, but not for the Chinese.
Yeah.
Because of your faith and ethnicity.
Sizning kim Uyg'ur bo'lganligingiz ham sizning diningiz ustidan, sizning e'tiqodingizda sabablikmi?
Not only Uyghur, because my ID have Xinjiang, that's Chinese, give us is Turkestan, because I am from East Turkestan. Mm-hmm. So because this, and the Uyghur also, because have Kazakh, have many, but if Chinese, no need check. Uyghur, ama Şarkı Türkistanlık boğalıqım 3 yıllam. Xtala undaq emas.
Just because of we are Uyghur, that's why we face this discrimination. For Chinese, there is no such thing. Just because of we're Uyghur and from East Turkestan, that's why.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. If I could, I'll start with Dr. Farr on this question. As you know, a little over 2 years ago, the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act was signed into law, and it provided a whole-of-government approach. It built on some of the early gains that was made by the original law authored by Frank Wolf, but some of the things we were not able to get into that law and lessons learned over the years. And you, as head of that office, did a remarkable job, and I want that clearly stated on the record for the IRFA office, International Religious Freedom Office. But I'm wondering, you know, now 2 years later, Ambassador Sam Brownback is obviously walking point as ambassador for religious freedom. Secretary Pompeo is, I think, all in when it comes to religious freedom. Vice President Pence and, of course, the President. But it always seems that China does not get the kind of focused scrutiny and call out that it ought to. And certainly it does not get the linkage to policies. I mean, even the IRFA sanctions, because they are a CPC country since the law was enacted, yeah, they're double-hatted with the Tiananmen Square sanctions. And it seems to me there needs to be a significant breakout of penalty imposed upon not just Magnitsky Act penalties, but other penalties. I think, Dr. Hoffman, you alluded to more needs to be done on the Chinese government. You know, and I would say this for the record, and I've done it in this commission before. I believe on human rights we were sold out by President Clinton. It's not a partisan dig, but he delinked most favored nation status from human rights, of which human religious freedom was a integral part. He did it in May 26th of 1994. I remember it. It was a Friday afternoon. Most members of Congress had left. A couple of people did instantaneous press conferences, including Nancy Pelosi and I, harshly criticizing that delinkage. And the Chinese government ever since has felt that human rights in general, religious freedom in particular, are ancillary issues and not at the core of our policy. So my first question would be to you, is there any evidence that the new law and the new emphasis, the new focus is having an impact? Secondly, if I could, and this would be to maybe Dr. Hoffman and maybe to you as well. Obviously, this brutal genocidal crackdown on the Uyghurs should rise to the levels of the United Nations as never before. Another genocide, another place, people being targeted in whole or in part. This seems as if it's in whole. To try to change, to replace. Even the celebrations that occur are stopped. You know, the melodies that are sung are barred, and of course, people like our distinguished witness suffers brutal torture, as do other women and men and children. What have the Muslim majority countries done, including the OIC and others, to say, stop this, China? You know, it seems as if Beijing gets away with, literally with murder, and in this case, genocide. What are the other Muslim countries doing? There's a very strong network. They are very effective and very domineering in many ways at the United Nations. Have they raised their voice in unison, or as individuals? Are there countries that rise to the fore, Muslim dominant countries that have spoken to the Chinese abuse of the Uyghurs? You, in your comments, make a very, if I could, Ms. Turson, a very, very strong statement that you hope the United States will lead the world community to condemn China's gross violations of universally recognized human rights, pressure China to close these concentration camps, and release millions of innocent Uyghurs and other minorities. You point out, I still remember the words of the Chinese authorities when they asked what my crime was. They said, you being a Uyghur is a crime. You say, please take action against the Chinese officials responsible for my torture and the death of my little boy and the deaths of so many innocent Uyghurs in the camps, and you go on. Obviously, this weekend, our president, President Trump, will be meeting with Xi Jinping face to face. If he were sitting right here, what would you say to him, all of you, as to what he should do? I get concerned with all presidents that they raise it, but not in the way that gets results. It has to be linked to policy. It has to be very public, I believe, because private diplomacy certainly has not had any impact here. So what would you say to President Trump if he were here? Dr. Farr, you spoke of the whole issue of the Vatican, and I couldn't agree with you more that I think was a colossal, or I believe it's a colossal blunder. And I think Cardinal Zen, in his op-ed in the New York Times, "The Pope Doesn't Understand China," was a very incisive commentary about the malevolence of China. You know, with Solzhenitsyn in his book, The Gulag Archipelago, and I remember reading it back in the early 80s, 81, when the Soviet Union was very much in focus for its persecution of faith. And he said, what you people in the West don't understand is that it's not a disbelief in God, it is a hatred of God. It is militant atheism. And as you all have pointed out, it's also a threat to their parastructure. So if you could speak to, Cardinal Zen, I think he is a courageous man. He understands exactly, as did Pope John Paul II, what communism is all about. It is not to be flattered or enabled. And I do think, and I personally have met with the head of the Three Self movement, and I remember having a very discouraging conversation with her, the Protestant Communist Front Group, when she was telling me how important it was to implement the one-child per couple policy with its heavy reliance on forced abortion, which is a crime against humanity and a crime of gender against women. And I remember meeting with Joseph Kung, Cardinal Kung's nephew, in Beijing, with Bishop Fu, who was the head of the Patriotic Association, and Joseph Kung took him to the cleaners, and use an American expression, in his lack of understanding of Catholic dogma, of the Bible. And it was like, here's the man that's running the church for the Communist Party, and now, unfortunately, there's a de facto, de jure collaboration between the Vatican for people just like him, who are enabling repression and religious persecution. So on those few questions, if you could, whoever would like to start first. Dr. Hoffman.
On the question about what countries are, other countries
The
are
Muslim countries especially.
Muslim in particular, I think the best answer I can give to your question based on my research is that what we're seeing play out right now shouldn't be entirely surprising. The Chinese Communist Party's perception of threat, if you really read party documents, it's written in People's Daily, for instance, going back. My research covers all the way to the 1940s, but even if you go back to 1989 in Tiananmen, one of the big things that the party is saying after that, for instance, is that it's a good thing that the PLA stepped up this time in support of the party, but what about next time? If you read, for instance, like the PLA immediately following and the years following the protests, one of the biggest threat perceptions that the party perceives is that actually the party can't manage itself. And that carries over into 1999 with the Falun Gong movement, because again, it's many senior members of the party that are involved in that. Senior members of the PLA, the PAP, and reportedly the Ministry of State Security as well, using resources from the nascent surveillance state to coordinate and organize the sit-in protest. They're the same people who are supposed to defend the party, and their job is to defend the party, not the state, in a time of crisis. And then you have the CCP talking about threat perceptions in relation to the color revolutions in the early 2000s. And you can see that this threat perception was something that the CCP was willing to act on at any cost to preserve its power. And preserving its power doesn't mean that it's just protecting its power, it means that it's expanding its power. And that expands into places like trying to change the way that we talk about concepts like sovereignty or human rights. I was in China in August, and in one of my meetings, I said to somebody, I was with an American delegation, and the word sovereignty kept coming up. And I said to the person across the table from me, you know, I'm pretty sure that we have different definitions of sovereignty. It's a difficult term to define anyway, but how would you define sovereignty? And he explained to me that sovereignty starts with political security, and political security is the party's security. And that if a person or a company says something like Taiwan is not a part of China, for instance, this is the example that this person used, then they're violating our sovereignty. And so over time, the CCP tries to address its threat perceptions not only by what it's doing in Xinjiang, but also changing the way that we're willing to talk about China in order to support the party's project to stay in power. And so it's been acting on these long-term threat perceptions forever. And for a long time, these are dismissed. The threat perceptions are seen as somewhat the party's paranoid, and they are, but that matters. And so I think it's not a direct answer to your question, but it's the best answer I can give, is that the writing's been on the wall for a very long time. We're just now seeing the worst consequences of the party being exactly what it is.
That was a great insight. If you could, any countries that come to mind, Saudi Arabia, Iran, that might be speaking out against what's happening to co-religious, other Muslims?
To be honest,
Malaysia, the largest.
This isn't something that I've paid particular attention to, so I don't want to give a bad answer to your question on the record. So,
Dr. Farr?
You asked a bunch of good questions, Mr. Smith. I'm going to pick two if I could. One is, what would I say to what would I have the President say to Mr. Xi Jinping? I would have the President say to him, stop persecuting your own people. It's bad for China's international reputation, but more importantly, it's bad for China's economy. I think this is something this President, a point he could make that others, it would be very, very powerful coming from him. And it also happens to be true. This is something that I wish our own religious freedom policy would be involved in, and that is making the argument that religious freedom is good for the economy, or the reverse, for a communist system. You don't have to have full religious freedom. Just back off. Stop your crackdowns. This is not rocket science, although people don't seem to get it, where you are brutalizing people. The economy is not going to grow. And whether it's in Zhejiang province or Tibet or throughout China, if you can learn to allow people to be religious, Chinese citizens, these are not foreigners, they will be more economically productive. There's plenty of evidence. We can present the evidence, but I think it's common sense. And coming from President Trump, I think this would be very, very powerful. And by the way, let's incorporate this into our international religious freedom policy with China. This is something I believe Ambassador Brownback believes and understands. Let's see it in China. Second question I'd like to answer is, you didn't quite ask it this way, but I would say to the Vatican, if you're going to keep this agreement, this provisional agreement, demand more from the Chinese. For example, propose a way for underground bishops to be involved in the nomination process that goes to Rome. That Rome should demand this. Second, provide a written guarantee in this agreement that you will criminalize any Chinese official, you will prosecute any Chinese official or Chinese citizen who effaces or destroys Catholic or other religious monuments, Marian shrines or any other kind of shrine, church, or, and here I would get into the problem of the Uyghur Muslims and the Tibetan Buddhists, demand this for them as well. This is a very Catholic thing to do. The Catholic Church stands for the religious freedom of all Chinese religious groups and citizens. Incorporate this into this provisional agreement. Now, the Holy Father has spoken out on the persecution of non-Christians and non-Catholics. Why not put this into this agreement? Demand something other than this Esau's bargain that they seem to have gotten for this procedure, which leads nowhere but the Pope vetoing these bishoprics, and they stay vacant if that happens. Or you put one of these communist apparatchiks in. I think they can do much better, and they have the moral authority to do that.
What would you say to President Trump if he were here?
Agar Prezident Trump mechada bo'lsa, men Prezident Trumpga birinchi deydiganim shu. Lagerlarni taqab, lagerdagi butun Uyg'urlarni qo'yib bersa.
If President Trump were here right now with us, first I would say that please help us to close down all the concentration, re-education camps, and to release all innocent Uyghurs.
Ikkinchidan, har qaysi davlatlarda turayotgan manga o'xshash yordamga muhtoj bo'layotgan Xitoyga qaytolmayotgan, vatanga qaytolmayotgan qolgan shu bichora Uyg'urlarga yordam qilib, ega chiqsa har qaysi shu Amerikadagi cho'ng davlatlar va boshqa davlatlar shu Uyg'urlarga ega chiqib yordam qilsa.
And also, if the America as well as other Western countries could help the Uyghurs like myself who needs help, who luckily came out from the country but unable to go back. And there are many Uyghur people, helpless Uyghurs like myself, who needs help of the United States and other countries.
And then number 3, I hope to tell him, please, American, if you can help us, independent East Turkestan, get out China from our country, help my father, mother. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hoffman, maybe you could answer this. Has the United Nations, particularly the Human Rights Council, been effective in raising the issue of the Muslim Uyghurs in China?
Although the issues come up, I don't think it's effective enough. I don't think
it certainly has not been a focus.
No, I think the problem is that it seems that, well, you said it yourself. I think it seems that China gets a free pass so often, and I think that this issue it should have never escalated to this point, because as I said before, this is something that we've seen happening. I mean, I was looking back when I was preparing for this testimony, reading some documents from this committee back in 2005, where you could see the direction that things were headed in Xinjiang. So I don't think, I don't think that the UN or the United States or any government has done enough, but hearings like this help. And one thing I would add is that if the camps were closed tomorrow, that would be obviously a positive step, but that's not solving the problem, because the problem is the Chinese Communist Party.
Okay, right. Yes, Dr. Farr.
I was just going to say that the UN Special Rapporteur for Religious Freedom, Ahmed Shahid, is really quite good, and I have not looked. I should have. I would hope that he is speaking out against this and has attempted to visit China to do a report on what is happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. If he hasn't, then perhaps the committee might write him a letter and suggest he do it.
Thank you. I would just, unless you have anything else you'd like to add, would conclude with just a couple of points. One, Rabia Kadir is here again with us today, and I remember when she gained her own freedom, she was warned, but she spoke out boldly and courageously on behalf of Uyghur Muslims and all people who are captive and harshly treated. I have always had a great admiration for her. And in keeping with this horrific crackdown by Xi Jinping, 40 members of her family now are either disappeared or incarcerated by China. There are 6 journalists with Radio Free Asia, Uyghur Division. They too have had their families rounded up and incarcerated or disappeared. All the more reason why this government and our president and this commission and every one of us need to quadruple our efforts to stop this horrific crackdown that has been initiated by Xi Jinping. In this case, under the false guise of terrorism and other pretexts. I remember when 9/11 occurred, obviously there were many people in my own district who were killed in the Twin Towers, and worked on that issue with a lot of issues that followed with the families, including the Jersey girls, 4 women who lost their husbands. And they called themselves that. They're probably the main reason why we got the 9/11 Commission. But that said, as that was happening, the Chinese government, and I immediately spoke to the Bush administration and people in it and said, the Chinese government is using 9/11 as a way of focusing on the Uyghurs. Right away, they were in solidarity with us, which was a false solidarity about their concern, but they were using it as a pretext to crack down on Muslims. So here we go again, and now it's on steroids under the dictatorship of Xi Jinping. But to Rabia Kadir and all of those who are suffering so horribly, I just want to say how our hearts and our prayers are with you, but we have to add to that our effective actions. And hopefully, you know, under Senator Marco Rubio, who's been a great chairman of this commission for the last 2 years, it's been my honor to serve as his co-chairman. Paul Protek, who has been our deputy chief of staff, and when I was chief of staff, I want to thank him for his tremendous leadership as well. This commission is needed now more than ever, as is the government's response. And so my hope is that this will be a further catalyst to effective action. Again, I want to thank our distinguished witnesses. You have been remarkable, and you provide us with a roadmap for the future. The hearing is adjourned. I would just add, it is adjourned. I would be open for 1 second to say that we'll remain open for 48 hours to receive any additional information, comments by members, and any additional material our distinguished witnesses would like to add. Hearing is adjourned.